Hello, I hope you're doing well. Today we want to talk a little bit about Clenard and Meyer's fourth chapter of their book, Sociology of Deviant Behavior, and this is going to cover major theories of deviance. When I think of theory, I think it's an abstract thing, and so what I want to give you here is more rather than less detail. So I'm going to split these videos into part 1 and part 2 in order to get at the complexities of the theory so that you don't feel as though you're not understanding. So if you want to watch this also too and take pauses and breaks, I think that might work so that you can reflect on these things and they stick a little bit better for you. To start, Clenard and Meyer talk about two different types of deviant theories. The first, structural. The second, processual. Structural theories, it says, focus on the relationship of deviance to certain structural conditions in society. So, for example, the amount of inequality you might have. These address the epidemiology of deviance, which is the distribution in time and space of deviant behavior, and why it's distributed the way it is. Processual theories, on the other hand, are emphasizing how individuals come to commit crimes through a process. So this addresses the etiology of deviance and specific causes of deviant acts. So we start with anomie theory, sometimes called strain theory. Anomie theory's core idea states that elements in society's structure promote deviance by making deviant behavior a viable adaptation to living in the society. Deviance is a result of certain social structural strains that pressure individuals to become deviant. So that's why it's also called strain theory. People are feeling like they're being pushed in a direction of deviance or crime. A question for you. You may or may not know the answer depending on whether you've read. Anomie theory was originally proposed in the 1930s by which theorist? You're welcome to pause this, take a look and see if you can find it. The answer is Robert Merton, D. And we'll talk now about Merton's work. Modern societies create strains, and these are upon individuals because those strains, they're emphasizing status goals while limiting institutional access. So the way I think about this is the promotion of the American dream. The American dream is all about the opportunity in the United States to start at humble beginnings and then achieve a better status. So this is a tension. You can ask yourself, the American dream, does it apply to everyone? Does everyone have equal legitimate access to achievement, to gaining their own home, their own wealth, and a sense of prestige? So it says there, cultural assumptions generally expect members to achieve goals through legitimate means. So conventional employment, well-paid occupations, the education that you're working on right now. So we all learn to aspire to this American dream of financial success. And it's funny because if you think about it, this isn't something where you see it all over the world. You don't hear about the Cambodian dream. You don't hear about the Estonian dream. The United States presents opportunity for people in a way that's different from a lot of other places around the world. However, it's important to note the second bullet. Legitimate channels are limited for those who are lower class. We all agree that it's harder for people who are poor to get to the American dream. And the theory contends that anomie is the social condition that results from emphasizing success goals much more strongly than the acceptable means by which people might achieve them. So the goal of success is held up, and the idea that you can do it through maybe illegitimate means, that is anomie. So Merton, in terms of adapting to strain, he postulated 4 methods of adaptation or mechanisms for people who are in an anomic society where they don't feel like they can achieve they can achieve the goals through legitimate means. So the 4 adaptations: ritualism, rebellion, innovation, and retreatism, we'll go through now. Ritualists. These are individuals who conform to society's norms, but they really don't have an expectation of achieving the goals. So ritualism means going through the motions. And my example there, Sam works very hard every day as a mechanic in a small town garage. He knows he'll never really achieve the American dream, but he continues to go through the motions, go to work every day to make a buck. Unlike ritualists, people may choose among several illegitimate adaptations when they can't reach the valued goals through legitimate means. So other ways that people might comport themselves: rebellion, innovation, and retreatism, we'll discuss now. First, rebellion. Individuals who conform to anomie by going against conventional cultural goals that they feel unable to achieve. So, like the title says, they rebel. These individuals will try to set up new goals and procedures that would change the social structure instead of trying to achieve the goals established by society. So again, they're trying to change the social structure through rebellion. Innovation. This is another mode of adaptation. Many conform to anomie by working toward culturally prescribed goals of success through illegitimate means, like theft, burglary, robbery, organized crime, or prostitution. So innovation is the mode of adaptation for Merton most closely associated with crime and criminal activity. An example: Kim comes from a low-income neighborhood with scarce resources, employment, and educational opportunities. In order for her to achieve the American dream, she becomes a dancer at a local strip club. Now in that example, because we're talking about deviance, her activities are not criminal, yet they're not necessarily seen by everybody as a legitimate means. She's innovating because she doesn't have the opportunities, because she's from a low-income neighborhood. Retreatism is another mode of adaptation. This is individuals who, after fully internalizing the cultural goals of success, they find those goals unattainable. However, the internalized pressures prevent them from adapting through innovation, and instead they feel defeated and they withdraw from conventional roles. So the ways that people would retreat, according to Merton, would be through drugs and alcohol. They're retreating away through escapism. The anomie perspective can also be extended, and a few theorists have done this. Cloward and Olin in the 1960s claimed that access to illegitimate means of achieving goals was something important, and that the lower class may have more opportunities than other classes to acquire deviant roles. So to unpack that for a second, Cloward and Olin were saying if you were in the lower classes, you might have, say, gangs around you or in your neighborhood, which is very different from the upper classes. So those might present opportunities, and that may lead to deviant criminal acts. Simon and Guénon, they argued absolute economic positions and relative economic positions were important. So in this instance, the bullet point at the bottom, corporate executives may commit white-collar crimes to expand their American dream. So they're arguing that this is not something that is absolute in terms of your position, but if, say, for example, you are fairly well-to-do, but there are people who are more well-to-do above you, you might then do illegitimate acts in order to get closer to them. The relative deprivation, the relative position, can also lead to illegitimate activities like crime. Further extensions of anomie perspective, Robert Agnew, social structure may create other types of strain through actions. So in his example, if you lose a job or you end a relationship, you're going to feel other types of strain, not necessarily economically linked, which might lead you to crime and or deviance. And Mesner and Rosenfeld came up with a theory where they extended the original ideas that Merton came up with to things like norms in the United States related, or I'm sorry, I should say values related to things like we value achievement. We also value individualism, and that's something that Merton didn't account for, and universal access to success. So, a question for you before starting the new material. Which of the following is not a criticism of anomie theory? The answer is D, complexity of explanation. So now I'll go through with you the other things which are criticisms of anomie theory. The first criticism, the assumption of universality. Anomie theory assumes universal standards of pursuing legitimate versus illegitimate means. However, that assumption is invalid. Deviance is a relative term, and it depends on various societies' interpretation of what counts as deviance. So there's no universality. Across societies, they see deviance in many different ways. So it says as an example at the bottom, the use of marijuana, cocaine, and opium does not constitute deviance in many parts of the world today. It would, at least for cocaine and opium these days, in the United States. If you were to evaluate anomie theory, you could also think it has a class bias. Anomie theory assumes that deviant behavior concentrates primarily on lower class individuals. Research indicates, though, that there's a disproportionate likelihood that members of the lower class will become labeled as deviant. And so this is an important thing to consider, that the label is applied to lower class people. However, research on higher class individuals indicates that deviance occurs in that category of people as well. Deviance isn't something that is necessarily based on class. It might be more about the focus of, say, law enforcement or scrutiny by people than it is the actual occurrence of deviance or crime. Another possible problem, the trouble with retreatism in Merton's theory. This is a very complex process, and it's argued here that anomie theory oversimplifies that. Those who turn to retreatism, becoming alcoholics or mentally ill, can do so for reasons beyond simply just a retreat. And then finally, the explanation of retreatism also fails to distinguish the origins of deviance from its effects. Here we see a chart, which is in your textbook and one that I've used many times in teaching deviance and criminology. And it lays out the modes of adaptation to an anomic society, such as our own, where we have that disconnect between the American dream, the goal, and the means of achieving it, the legitimate means. So what you can see here, conformity, this is when people agree with the goal. And here, the plus sign, they agree with the norms. So right now, you are a conformist. You believe in the American dream. You're trying to access it through the legitimate means of education leading to a good job. Innovation is the one that Merton linked most with crime. Believing in the American dream, but not going to pursue it through the legitimate means. Ritualism, you can see the differences there. Retreatism, this is a rejection of both the goals and means. And here, under rebellion, you see the legend there. It says plus and minus means a substitution. So they're substituting the values and goals. They're substituting the norms and means. So I think this chart is very useful if you find it in your text to think through these ideas. Next, conflict theory. Conflict theories address the origins of rules or norms, rather than being about the origins of behavior that violate established standards. So the conflict is in the establishment, as it says, of rules or norms, not as much about the behavior, really. So the second bullet point, the sub-bullet point, this view stresses the pluralistic nature of society and the differential distribution of power among groups. So there are different groups in society with different amounts of power. Conflict theories argue individuals with social power create rules and norms that are in the interest of that group. Powerful people create rules and norms that reproduce their position. So this creates a collection of groups with competing interests, and they are in conflict with one another. Deviance represents behavior that conflicts with the standards of powerful segments of society that are able to shape public opinion and social policy. Sociological theorists such as Marx, Georg Simmel, and Koser and Dahrendorf describe society not as a product of consensus over shared values, but as the outcome of a continuing struggle between social classes. So the idea is that we don't agree on normative behavior. The focus for these theorists is on that essential conflict between those who have power to create norms, laws, and those who have less. Definitions of deviance, then, emerge from class conflict between powerful and less powerful groups. Marx viewed society as a relationship between two groups of economic interests, or two classes. First, the bourgeoisie. This is the ruling class, also known as the owners of the means of production, the way in which material objects are produced. People who own, for example, factories. The proletariat, in contrast, would be members of society who are ruled by the bourgeoisie. So these typically are the workers, the people who work for the bourgeoisie. The state does not act as a neutral party in this balance. There is inevitable conflict between the two groups. The conflict, though, is mainly about protecting the ruling class against threats from the ruled masses. Again, because the ruling classes like this arrangement and want to reinforce it. Marx explained that laws prohibit certain acts that threaten the ruling class from the ruled class. As an example, we see armed robbery as having a much, much higher penalty than many forms of white-collar crime. Say, for example, some environmental crime. There can be forms of environmental crime that are far more devastating in terms of social harm than, say, for example, one armed robbery. But the penalty for those environmental crimes may be just a fine, whereas this individual faces maybe a decade or two in prison. Laws legitimize intervention by society's social control agents, such as police, courts, and corrections. Criminal law comes to side with the upper classes against the lower classes. So my example of this is if you've ever seen the television show Cops. You never see a man in a three-piece suit getting thrown over the hood of the cop car and arrested. It's usually people who barely have shirts on with tattoos, the scrutiny of the lower classes and kind of managing of those people. Despite significant theoretical differences among various conflict theorists, they generally share a view of criminal behavior as a reflection of social power differentials. The elite and the powerless have different interests. Measures that benefit the elite work against the powerless. Other conflict theories. Conflict theorists view criminal behavior as a rational act. Now, this is a slight modification by Taylor and his other researchers. So the sub-bullet point, burglars steal from houses because of social conditions like unequal distribution of wealth, which force them to participate in criminal behaviors. So conflict theorists perceive crime as an unchangeable feature of capitalism. Capitalism reproduces a system of inequality, and that is inextricable from understanding what counts as crime and deviant. Social threats are also to be considered. Liska holds that conventional views assert that crime control efforts increase as crime increases. However, the social threat hypothesis denies that there's a direct relationship. Threats may come from behavior defined as undesirable or from people or groups defined as inherently dangerous, regardless of their behavior. The social threat hypothesis is also consistent with the continuing increase in U.S. correctional populations at a time of relative, stable, or even declining crime rates. So the social threat hypothesis, he said, is also consistent with this continuing increase in the U.S. correctional population. The population still seems to grow, even though there may not necessarily be an increase in crime. And that's a paradox that this theory helps address. You have issues about the recent concerns related to drug use and the incarceration of people for drug use, which you can argue is not a terribly effective way of dealing with that. And the creation of moral panics, like we saw before, panics related to things like child kidnapping and satanic cults. A question for you. Left realists, what we're about to discuss, advocate that crime emerges when four components intersect. Which of the following is one of those components or concepts? A key here for left realists would be it's the state. Left realism, I should explain too. The left means liberals. The right typically are conservatives. So this is about political orientation. Left realism would mean that these are people who are liberally oriented, but they also look at what's thought of as the reality of crime, that crime has these real dimensions, which are not necessarily class related. So there is street crime. There are certain types of crime that people know and understand. Left realism scholars advocate that crime emerges when four components intersect. So they look at victims, offenders, as well as the state, the government, and public opinion. So those components together are referred to as the square of crime, the four corners of it. Like other conflict-based perspectives, left realism acknowledges the state's active role in the process of criminalizing certain behaviors. The state enacts laws that reflect established political and economic inequalities and interests. Public attitudes toward crime can shift legal and correctional priorities, making them another part of the general crime process. So even though the state is involved, you have public perception as well, which helps create what counts as crime and deviance. In developing a realistic approach to crime, left realist scholars recognize, again, as I said, the danger of crime. There are crimes, and those are important to focus on. This isn't just some abstract class-based issue. The origins and conditions of social and economic inequality. So they're trying to take into account both the economic inequality as well as the fact that, as it implied in the title, there are real dangers related to crime and criminal activity. The position implies that reductions in inequality and more general promotion of social justice will substantially reduce crime. If we're evaluating this model, there's some ways to do it. You can ask, is this an explanation of rules or behavior? First, conflict theories offer little information about the process by which an individual comes to commit crimes or becomes a deviant. So Again, this is a structural theory, not a process-based theory. The focus is more on the origins of laws and norms, but fails to explain individual action. Conflict theories ignore the socialization process and assume that political considerations alone motivate deviance. Again, a structural theory, not about individuals and the socialization that they go through. Another question you can ask about it, who benefits in the conflict model? There's doubt that one particular group devises and enforces all laws for its sole advantage. U.S. residents typically agree on the immorality of conventional crimes. So the powerful people don't dictate everything. And that makes sense, that would be a criticism. Some statements made by conflict theorists are very broadly defined as well. So for example, the notion, quote, laws disproportionately benefit the elite, neglects the fact that most of these offenses victimize other poor people, lower class people, urban residents. They don't victimize members of the elite. It's typically that poor people victimize other poor people. And so in some ways this theory deserves some criticism. A couple of others before I go into the second part of this discussion of Chapter 4. Powerful groups and social roles. Conflict theories rely on an overly broad assumption that powerful groups dictate, first, the contents of criminal law, second, the rule-making processes, and third, enforcement solely to promote their own interests. There are a lot of different groups, as it says there, that contribute to lawmaking besides elites. Finally, we can think about the law and causes of behavior. Conflict perspectives hold that criminal law causes criminal behavior by defining specific acts as crime. However, law standards for deviance induce people to commit deviant acts.